President Trump is right. How can a president be able to cancel treaties but not foreign aid? Hello, this is Robert Romano, Executive Director with Americans for Limited Government and Americans for Limited Government Foundation. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about President Donald Trump's freeze of foreign aid. It actually began on January 20th when he took office. He signed an executive order to do with freezing foreign aid. And this has led to several court decisions now, injunctions that have been placed upon, seemingly placed upon the president's ability to, stop spending this money. Now, there's you can kind of break this into two categories. One is monies that were already obligated under President Biden during his tenure in office, and then future obligations that have not yet been obligated, that President Trump might he might not want to send out more foreign aid, or if a country is no longer considered an ally or something like that, he might want to condition foreign aid. So it's say, hey, you want to get some help from the United States? Well, we need X, Y, and Z. For example, President Trump just did that with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. We were pausing military aid as well as intelligence sharing in order to bring Zelensky and Ukraine to the peace negotiating table. President Trump's been negotiating a ceasefire with Russia and Ukraine. And, in order to bring them to the table, you have to use things like, it could be aid to Ukraine. It could be threatening sanctions. He's done that against Russia in order to bring them to the table. In any event, this is all part of the president's core Article 2 responsibilities under the U.S. Constitution, and has a long tradition going all the way back to the George Washington administration, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. I wanted to share my screen here, and we can go right to my piece here. Trump is right. How can a president be able to cancel treaties but not foreign aid? So maybe the most famous example of a president canceling a treaty was George Washington in the 1793 Proclamation of Neutrality. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's a few others. ABM Treaty 1972 got withdrawn from, as well as the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty 1987 that got withdrawn from. But in any event, at a recent address to a joint session of Congress on March 4th, President Trump noted that upon taking office, he had, quote, imposed an immediate freeze on all foreign aid via January 20th executive order. And here's that executive order, which we will read from. Under the executive order, departments and agencies were to stop all, quote, new obligations and disbursements, quote, all department and agency heads with responsibility for United States foreign development assistance programs shall immediately pause new obligations and disbursements of development assistance funds to foreign countries and implementing non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and contractors pending reviews of such programs for programmatic efficiency and consistency with United States foreign policy to be conducted within 90 days of this order. So we're, I believe, already almost 60 days into that review. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, presidents set American foreign policy, whether negotiating new treaties or terminating old ones. And we're going to look at the 1793 Proclamation of Neutrality. This is a very important moment in the very first presidential administration. On April 22, 1793, President George Washington issued a neutrality proclamation to define the policy of the United States in response to the spreading war in Europe. Quote, the duty and interest of the United States require, the proclamation stated, quote, that they, the United States, should with sincerity and good faith adopt and pursue a conduct friendly and impartial towards the belligerent powers. The proclamation warned Americans that the federal government would prosecute any violations of this policy by its own citizens and would not protect them should they be tried by a belligerent nation. This statement of policy triggered a fierce reaction from those who considered it a sellout of the nation's revolutionary soul for the financial gain of the merchant class. One anonymous correspondent wrote, the cause of France is the cause of man and neutrality is desertion. So here we were telling France to go pound sand if they wanted to go start wars all over Europe. Well, that treaty that we were involved with during the Revolutionary War, that's no longer in effect. And we're not going to honor it. That's not what George Washington, he was still trying to get the nation on its feet. Critics believe that the proclamation marked a dishonorable betrayal of our oldest and dearest ally and to a sacred alliance in the darkest hours of the American Revolution. The proclamation was important for the constitutional precedent established in the exertion of executive authority in the realm of foreign policy, as well as for exciting partisan passions that were formative to the creation of political parties in the first party system. Several important, this is the mountainvernon.org, by the way. This is a history, I guess that's the Washington Library. Several important recent developments in both America and Europe led to America and Europe led to Washington's neutrality proclamation. The French Revolution had turned more radical when it beheaded King Louis XVI in January 1793. 10 days later, revolutionary France, already fighting Austria and Prussia, declared war on England, Holland, and Spain, embroiling the entire European continent in conflict. Lastly, on April 8, 1793, the new French minister, Edmond Guénée, arrived in Charleston, South Carolina. Guinea was an instant hit with the American people who flocked in large numbers to greet the ebullient Frenchman as he made his way north to the capital in Philadelphia. More ominous, however, was the fact that Guinea, armed with commissions and letters of marque from his government, actively recruited Americans to fight for revolutionary France. Does this sound familiar? Deeply concerned with Guinea's infectious popularity and his direct appeals to the American people to aid France, and unsure of the boundaries of his own constitutional powers, Washington called his cabinet together in April of 1793, April 19, to solicit their advice. Despite some disagreements between Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton on related issues, the four members of the cabinet unanimously agreed that the president could and should issue a statement affirming the neutrality of the United States in the European-wide war, that his government should receive Guinea as the French minister, despite his hostility to the authority of the federal government. Attorney General Edmund Randolph wrote the 293-word proclamation for the president's signature. It ignited a firestorm of criticism. Much of the American population sympathized with revolutionary France. In a series of letters written under the pseudonym Pacificus, Alexander Hamilton took up the task of defending the administration in the press by arguing that neutrality was in the best interest of the United States. Furthermore, Hamilton asserted that the 1778 Treaty of Alliance was a defensive arrangement and it was not applicable to 1793 because France had declared war on its enemies, an offensive act. Aggravated by Hamilton's claims of broad executive power and frustrated by the language of Randolph's final draft of the proclamation, Thomas Jefferson organized a response to Pacificus. At the pleading of his friend and Secretary of State, Hamilton's former Federalist Papers collaborator, Congressman James Madison, took up the cause of the opposition in a series of letters under the pen name of Helveticus that countered the arguments of Pacificus. Madison and Hamilton provided each side of the growing partisan chasm between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans with powerful talking points. Now, ultimately, this becomes, I think, one of the most important precedents in Article 2 executive power as we know it under the Constitution, because the president could suspend a foreign commitment. And presidents have done this. The ABM Treaty was another one that it was negotiated in 1972 by Richard Nixon, but it was withdrawn by George W. Bush in 2002. And also the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty by Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. That was in 1987, went into effect 1988, but it was withdrawn in 2019 by Donald Trump. So this is my question. If in terminating the ABM, there was actually a Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel offered an opinion in 2001 that we want to look at here. This was memorandum for John Bellinger III, Senior Associate Counsel to the President and Legal Advisor to the National Security Council, from John C. Yu, then Deputy Assistant Attorney General. This gives you kind of a look at how the Justice Department in the modern era looks at the issue of suspending or withdrawing from treaties that have been adopted by 2/3 of the United States Senate. Let's see here. Here's some background on the ABM Treaty. The President, Section 2, the President's constitutional authority over treaties. Presidential authority over treaties stems from the president's leading textual and structural position in foreign affairs generally, from the text and structure of Article 2's vesting of all of the federal executive power in the president, and from the specific manner in which the Constitution allocates the treaty power. Construing the Constitution in this matter comports with the president's Article 2 responsibilities to conduct the foreign affairs of the nation, to act as its sole representative in international relations, and to exercise the powers of the chief executive. Historical practice also plays an important role in resolving separation of powers questions relating to foreign affairs. Judicial decisions in the area are rare, while the need for discretion and speed of action favor deference to the arrangements of the political branches. The historical evidence supports the claim that the president has broad constitutional powers with respect to treaties, including the powers to terminate and suspend them. In light of considerations of all three kinds, textual, structural, and historical, we conclude that the president has the constitutional authority to suspend a provision of the ABM Treaty. We begin with the constitutional text and structure. Article 2, Section 1 declares that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Article 2, Section 2 further makes clear that the president shall be commander-in-chief, that he shall appoint with the advice and consent of the Senate and receive ambassadors, and that he, quote, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. Article 2, Section 3, Clause 2. Congress possesses its own plenary foreign affairs powers, primarily those of declaring war, raising and funding the military, and regulating international commerce. From the very beginnings of the Republic, this constitutional arrangement has been understood to grant the president plenary control over the conduct of foreign relations. As Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson observed during the first Washington administration, quote, the Constitution has divided the powers of government into three branches and has declared that, quote, the executive powers shall be vested in the president, submitting only special articles of it to a negative by the Senate. Due to this structure, Jefferson continued, quote, the transaction of business with foreign nations is executive altogether. It belongs then to the head of that department, except as to such portions of it as are specially submitted to the Senate. Exceptions are to be construed strictly. That was Thomas Jefferson's opinion on the powers of the Senate, reprinted and it's set from 1790. That opinion is from 1790. In defending President Washington's authority to issue the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793, Alexander Hamilton came to the same interpretation of the president's foreign affairs powers. According to Hamilton, Article 2, quote, ought to be considered as intended to specify and regulate the principal articles implied in the definition of executive power, leaving the rest to flow from the general grant of that power. That was 1793, and that was Pacificus number 1. Hamilton further contended that the president was, quote, the constitutional organ of intercourse between the United States and foreign nations. That was Pacificus number 7 in 1793. As future Chief Justice John Marshall famously declared a few years later, the president is the sole organ of the nation in its external relations and is its sole representative with foreign nations. The executive department is entrusted with the whole foreign intercourse of the nation. And that was from 1800 from John Marshall. Given the agreement of Jefferson, Hamilton, and Marshall, it has not been difficult for the executive branch to consistently assert the president's plenary authority in foreign affairs ever since. In the relatively few occasions where it has addressed foreign affairs, the Supreme Court has lent its approval to the executive branch's consistent interpretation of the president's powers. Responsibility for the conduct of foreign affairs and for protecting the national security are, as the Supreme Court has observed, quote, central presidential domains. That was Harlow v. Fitzgerald in 1982. The president's constitutional primacy flows from both his unique position in the constitutional structure and from specific grants of authority in Article 2 that make the president both the chief executive of the nation and the commander-in-chief. That's, again, Nixon v. Fitzgerald, 1982. Due to the president's constitutionally superior position, the Supreme Court has consistently recognized, quote, the generally accepted view that foreign policy is the province and responsibility of the executive. The Department of Navy v. Egan. This foreign affairs power is exclusive. It is, quote, the very delicate plenary and exclusive power of the president as sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations, a power which does not require as a basis for its exercise an act of Congress. And that's the United States v. Curtis Wright Export Corporation in 1936. In light of these basic principles, it should be understood that the treaty power is fundamentally executive in nature. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution provides that, quote, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. By contrast, Article 1's vesting clause gives Congress only the powers herein granted. That's Article 1, Section 1. So herein granted. So the President has all of the executive power, but Congress only has some of the legislative powers, those enumerated powers that are explicitly provided therein. This difference in language indicates that Congress's legislative powers are limited to the list enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, while the president's powers include the inherent executive powers that are unenumerated in the Constitution. Thus, as we will explain in detail later, any ambiguities in the allocation of a power that is executive in nature, particularly in foreign affairs, must be resolved in favor of the executive branch. And on it goes. This really raises, I think, an interesting question, which is that if a president can cancel a treaty under this basis, terminate treaties, which require 2/3 of the Senate to approve, including those that establish military alliances, as an inherent exercise of Article 2 executive power, how can he not stop foreign aid to countries who might no longer be considered allies by the president? I say that's a good question, but not one that has yet been taken up by U.S. District Judge Ali Amir for the District of Columbia, who on February 13 ruled that the payments had to resume. And so then the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in. John Roberts, he put a stay on that, pending a hearing of the case by the Supreme Court, lifting a U.S. District Court order that the payments continue in spite of Trump's freeze. But then the Supreme Court backed away from the case on March 5th, issuing a decision that lifted the Supreme Court's stay on Judge Amir's ruling. And I think we have that right here. We could zoom in a little. Here we go. The Chief Justice entered an administrative stay shortly before 11:59 p.m. deadline and subsequently referred the application to the court. The application is denied. Given that the deadline in the challenged order has now passed, and in light of the ongoing preliminary injunction proceedings, the district court shall clarify what obligations the government must fulfill to ensure compliance with the temporary restraining order, with due regard for the feasibility of any compliance timelines. The order heretofore entered by the Chief Justice is vacated. So the Supreme Court stepped in. They said, wait a second, district court, we're not sure you can do that. Then they said, no, go ahead. So now the case continues. Then greenlighting Judge Amir to proceed with the case. On March 10th, he appears to be on the verge of expanding his decision, or he appeared to be expanding his decision and to include a brand new requirement, first of its kind in the history of the Republic, that all appropriations made by Congress have to be spent. I find this to be a remarkable decision. Let's see if we got the right one here. Yes, this is the March 10th ruling from Amir. The provision and administration of foreign aid has been a joint enterprise between our two political branches. That partnership is built not out of convenience, but out of constitutional necessity. It reflects Congress and the executive's firmly established shared constitutional responsibilities over foreign policy, and reflects the division of authorities dictated by the Constitution as it relates to the appropriation of funds and executing on those appropriations. Congress, exercising its exclusive Article 1 power of the purse, appropriates funds to be spent toward specific policy aims. The president, exercising a more general Article 2 power, decides how to spend those funds in faithful execution of the law. And so foreign aid has proceeded over the years. But not all the monies always get spent. So there's some ambiguity about a necessity to spend all of the money. There's often unspent monies. So let's go back to the piece here. We've read a little bit of this decision. The ruling provides that any services rendered must be paid. Okay, so we'll go to the bottom of the ruling because that's where where all of the dictates upon the Trump administration and the State Department are being made by the judge. We got to scroll down here, go to the bottom. Okay. The restrained defendants accordingly shall not withhold payments or letters of credit drawdowns for work completed prior to February 13, 2025. And the restrained defendants are enjoined from unlawfully impounding congressionally appropriated foreign aid funds and shall make available for obligation the full amount of funds that Congress appropriated for foreign assistance programs in the further Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2024. So here he says, you have to spend all the money, basically. You have to make it available. He says, shall make it available for obligation, the full amount of funds that Congress appropriated. Okay. Aren't they already available for obligation technically? I mean, the Trump administration could spend them right now. That's what the appropriations law says. They're just not doing it. So that's the real question, right? How can Congress compel them to spend the money if they said, hey, State Department, here's a bunch of money, and you figure out how to spend it on foreign aid. We don't know what to spend it on, and you decide. They already gave the president the discretion to spend it. Okay, so now a separate injunction. So I think that this kind of differs from another court decision. This has to do with a memorandum by the Office of Management and Budget, which actually got rescinded after it was put forward. But it was put forward on January 27th, and this was a temporary pause of agency grant, loan, and other financial assistance programs. It's related to the other case, the USAID case, the foreign aid case, because it invoked the same executive order. But it also invoked other executive orders, such as the president's executive order against diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which he says violates Title VI and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act as discriminatory against race and sex. It has racial and gender hiring quotas included. So they want to look at all grants that are going out that might be doing stuff that is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, equal protection, and under the Civil Rights Act, which Congress had the power to enact under the 14th Amendment. So there's this memo, and then there was another decision to do with that. The U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, and this was from Lauren Alicon. This was a different injunction that was placed upon the overall spending freeze by OMB. So it's just actually a separate case against the net. But these cases might end up being consolidated. That would freeze all federal contracts, had only sought to limit the injunction to all open awards. But this is the injunction. When Lauren Alicon did it, she said, this only applies to all open awards, but not to affect OMB's memorandum as it pertains to the, quote, the issuance of new awards or other relevant agency actions that may be implicated by the executive orders. So this was a more narrow injunction compared to what we just saw on March 10th. So now Amir appears to want to go much, much further, saying that if Congress appropriates money for a purpose, it must be spent. Or did he? Amir appeared to balk at the edge of such a ruling, stating, quote, the court accordingly denies plaintiffs' proposed relief that would unnecessarily entangle the court in supervision of discrete or ongoing executive decisions, as well as relief that goes beyond what their claims allow. The separation of power dictates only that the executive follow Congress's decision to spend funds, and both the Constitution and Congress's laws have traditionally afforded the executive discretion on how to spend within the constraints set by Congress. Therefore, Amir concluded, quote, the appropriate remedy is accordingly to order the defendants to, quote, make available for obligation the full amount of funds Congress appropriated under the relevant laws. Now, I noted earlier, there's just one problem. The funds are already available for obligation ever since they've been enacted. They're just not being obligated. They haven't been impounded. They've not been submitted to Congress as saying, let's rescind those. So they're not a proposed rescission at this point. And so it's just, the money's just kind of sitting there. But that's nothing new. Every single year, Congress appropriates monies that do not get fully spent, as I had noted earlier. Sometimes Congress provides a one-year window for funds, and other times a multi-year window. And we're going to look at a February 2024 report by the Congressional Review Service. This is like the Congress's think tank. Expiration and cancellation of unobligated funds. They even have provision or what happens to monies that are appropriated by Congress and not spent by the executive, meaning that this happens all the time. It happens so often. It's like, oh, there's this money just sitting in an account. We should pass a law about what happens to the money just in case the president doesn't spend it. And this happens a lot. There were a lot of, for example, during COVID, there was a $350 billion fund to state and local governments, and a bunch of it was not spent. So then they ended up repurposing it for infrastructure projects during the Biden administration. You could say, oh, they should have returned it to the Treasury. They should have paid down debt. But under these laws, they were able to repurpose it, but with an act of Congress. There's actually a good table here, example of the expiration of cancellation of unobligated funds. Say 10 million is appropriated in 2020. After the period, $2 million remains. On September 30 to 2020, the 2 million remaining balance in the account is no longer available for incurring new obligations because the period of availability has passed. And then we enter a 5-year period. Expired funds are available for a 5-year period following that. And this is all under 31 USC 1552 to 1555. And we look at some of those here, 31 USC Section 1552, procedure for appropriation accounts available for definite periods, and also 1553, availability of appropriation accounts to pay obligations. And we'll read from that. But we'll also read from the Congressional Review Service. In most cases, appropriated funds may be obligated only during the defined period of availability. 1-year funds are appropriations that remain available for obligation for 1 year. Multi-year funds are appropriations that remain available for obligation for more than 1 year. Congress has even provided for a procedure for automatically canceling unobligated funds after a 5-year period if they have not been repurposed. So if you get to the end of 1 year, say it's a 1-year funding, then there's a period of 5 years where it can be repurposed. But if it's not, then on September 30th of the fiscal year, after the period of availability for obligation of a fixed appropriation account ends, the account shall be closed, and any remaining balance, whether obligated or unobligated in the account, shall be canceled, and thereafter shall not be available for obligation or expenditure for any purpose. So not only is the president not obligated to spend the money, if he doesn't spend the money, it will ultimately be canceled, albeit after 5 years. And here I post that chart for everyone to see. But departments and agencies under the law are under no obligation to spend the money, as I just noted. Under 31 U.S. Code Section 1553, under subsection A, it states if the monies are unspent, they will remain available for reappropriation. And we can look at that under subsection A. After the end of the period of availability for obligation of a fixed appropriation account and before the closing of that account under section 1552A of this title, the account shall retain its fiscal year identity and remain available for recording, adjusting, and liquidating obligations properly chargeable to that account. Properly chargeable for an amount for 4 million to be spent on something, and then it goes on for an amount above 4 million. Now, if you get to the end of the funding term and then you want to repurpose it within the executive branch, here's how they could do it. For an amount above 4 million to be spent on something else can only be done at the discretion of the head of the agency. And for amounts above 25 million, then the agency head must submit a notice to the House and Senate Appropriations committees within 30 days. So what might happen for contracts already let by the federal government under former President Joe Biden's tenure? It might be that federal courts continue to say that those contracts must be executed. But for new contracts, there does not appear to be a means, short of Congress not delegating so much spending discretion to the executive, to compel Trump to spend the money. Under the law, if they are not obligated, they will become unobligated and then after a period of time return to the Treasury. Now, instead, the president might decide that it's better to hold back certain funds as a means of negotiating with foreign governments, saying, hey, we've got this foreign aid. Would you like some foreign aid? We'd like to give you some foreign aid, but I expect X, Y, and Z to happen. Trump's the art of the deal president. So wouldn't be surprised if he wanted to use foreign aid as a negotiating chip. As he recently did with Ukraine, temporarily withholding military and intelligence aid in order to compel Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the peace table. Again, if the president, not just President Trump, But any president can withdraw from a treaty, then he can withhold foreign aid to achieve a foreign policy objective. But if this keeps up, and I'm getting to the close here, where courts try to spend the money on behalf of the executive branch, Congress might just consider suspending the Impoundment Control Act, certainly an option. This was enacted in the 1970s. Richard Nixon was impounding a lot of funds, but so were a lot of previous presidents. In fact, all the presidents from Thomas Jefferson all the way through Richard Nixon were using their inherent executive power to impound funds that said, "Oh, I don't need that money. You're giving me money. I don't want to spend it. Oh, you want me to buy these ships? I don't need these ships. We're not going to buy those ships." And so there'd be a lot of impoundments that had happened during the course of U.S. Political history. And this continued all the way through the Nixon administration. Finally, Congress said, no, 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 you have to spend the money. And here's a list of rules you have to follow. If you want to impound money, you have to come to us, and we're going to decide whether or not you spend the money or not. But at the end of the day, you really can't compel the president to spend the money unless you say, spend it on this. You have to spend it on this. But if they don't know what to spend money on, they just say, here's several $billion for foreign aid. You figure it out. Then the president really, the money can just sit there. It may ultimately end up what happens. But Congress could suspend the Impoundment Control Act. Or perhaps Trump could just tell the State Department to use any unobligated funds or unused foreign aid dollars for another type of distribution to foreign actors. Start paying off the $8.5 trillion of treasuries that are owed to foreign creditors. Here those are. You can see it right here. Grand total. It's a little hard to read. 8.5 trillion. Let's see. Who could we pay off first? We could. Japan seems to have borrowed or lent us a lot of money. They have $1 trillion of $1 trillion and 59 billion. $1 trillion 59 billion. 800 million of treasuries. So we could start paying off Japan. I say maybe we pay off Japan first. Maybe we let China wait till last. The United Kingdom, maybe we give the United Kingdom some money. So rather than give money to foreign aid, President Trump could just tell the State Department, pay off this debt, and you'll eliminate debt. It's the same thing as freezing it and returning it to the Treasury. I think, the money's all fungible. So here's a foreign enterprise or something you could send the money to, send it to the foreign creditors. If nobody else, it'll pay down debt. I think that's a solution. If all else fails and the courts are going to say, you have to spend this money. It's like, are you sure? You really sure you want me to spend all this money? Okay, fine. We're paying off all the debt owed to the foreign creditors. There you go. Just pay down the debt. There, it got spent on foreign actors. Happy? This is Robert Romano, Executive Director of Americans for Limited Government and Americans for Limited Government Foundation. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day. But first, we're going to look at the chat here, see what you're up to. Appreciate you all tuning in. Let's see here. Just a few chats here. Let's see. If you chat, though, I'll read them. F the Democrats and their judges. Okay. That was Lee Covey. And here's Stan Graham. The judge is not only exceeding his constitutional authority, but is acting in opposition to historical precedent. I agree with all of that. Clearly, I think, once again, the law is on President Trump's side. The Constitution is on his side. If he can cancel a treaty, he can certainly cancel foreign aid or freeze it or just not spend it. Congress didn't say send this amount of money to this country, but even if they did, well, they gave a lot of money to Ukraine and Trump suspended that. And he said military aid, intelligence sharing. Well, we're going to hold that off until you sit down and talk to Russia or talk to us at least about doing a ceasefire, etc. So President Trump's trying to negotiate with Ukraine and with Russia, and he used the military aid that's going to Ukraine as a mechanism and withholding it as a mechanism to bring them to the table. Now, I suppose if Zelensky's not going to the local district court and the District of Columbia and then saying, give me my military aid, and then the judge is saying, yeah, give him the military aid, President Trump. You have to give him the military aid. As long as we don't cross that threshold, I think the Article 2 powers are probably broadly intact. And ultimately, Trump will prevail on many, if not most, or all of these questions when the Supreme Court finally does get around to hearing a case, as they almost certainly will. Again, this is Robert Romano, Executive Director with Americans for Limited Government and Americans for Limited Government Foundation. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.